You guys hear me?
Yeah, can we just turn it back to the time until we, you just go.
That's you?
Hey, Councilor McMaster and Sloman, we're gonna do a sound test. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
We'll do this one. You can stay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back on mute for a couple minutes.
By unanimous consent.
All right, it's 2:30. And I'm going to be the chair today. I call the meeting to order. January 24th, 2023. We acknowledge that the District of Tofino operates within the territory of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. And this is a notice to attendees that the meeting is being video recorded and will be published on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. And approval of meeting location by unanimous consent if no one objects. I move that pursuant to section 15 of the District of Tofino meeting procedure bylaw number 1229, 2016 as amended, the January 24th, 2023 special committee of the whole meeting be held electronically via Zoom and live broadcasted on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. And that the facility provided for the public to watch and hear the meeting be located at Municipal Hall, 380 Campbell Street in Tofino, BC. Seeing no objection, motion is carried. All right, down to item 4, presentations and reports. No?
Adoption agenda.
Oh, adoption of bridge. Sorry. I recommend that the January 24th, 2023 special committee of the whole agenda be adopted. All
You have
right.
to call a vote.
Do I? Oh, sorry.
It's all good. You're doing great.
Thanks. Then we vote. Any objections?
Say all in favor.
All in favor?
Motion.
Motion is carried.
Perfect.
And now down to item 4.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So I'm just here to do a very brief introduction to the Development Approvals Framework project. Largely, this is for some of the newer councillors, as well as a bit of a refresher for some of the councillors who have heard of this project before. It's largely an internal project intended to streamline the district development approvals process. So these are all the existing processes that we use to regulate development in the community, things like zoning or subdivision development variance permits, a lot of the stuff that you would see planning staff such as myself or Jill up here talking to you guys about on a fairly regular basis. This project really comes out of actual provincial initiative that was kind of completed in approximately 2019. The province was looking for ways largely to find opportunities to encourage housing to be created. One of the things they have identified is that sometimes development approval processes at a municipal level are less efficient than they could be. And so this largely provincial kind of initiative was created. Out of this initiative came a grant opportunity that the district applied for through the Union of British Columbia Municipalities. And in the summer of 2021, that grant was successful for about $250,000. Thanks to the efforts of Mr. Aaron Rogers and our previous CAO, Bob McPherson. And really the purpose of this grant is to look for opportunities for the district to kind of speed up our process, improve transparency, improve efficiencies, and really just allow for a more uniform, predictable process. There was an RFP prepared in association with this grant, I believe in the fall of 2021. After that process went out, Urban Systems was awarded the contract to work with us on this overall project. As they have been working through some of the project deliverables, where we're at today is that there's a few things that actually require some council input, which is why we're having a committee of the whole meeting, but also it's a little bit of a workshop as well. It'll be fairly interactive, I believe, as we go through it. So Nancy Henderson, who is acting as the lead for Urban Systems on this project, will be facilitating this session. She'll be presenting some of the work that's happened so far and also kind of outlined some of the input that we would be looking for from council today in order to better understand how we might move forward. So largely the stuff today will be pertaining to our development approvals bylaw, which is really our specific bylaw that outlines our process for how any of these kinds of development processes happen, from permits all the way to zoning bylaws or even subdivisions and other related activities. So depending on council preference, the bylaw might be drafted in a couple ways, depending on how council would like to. A lot of the conversation will revolve around public consultation approaches as well as delegation, those kinds of things. Nancy will be taking you through all that as she moves through her presentation. But council's input here will kind of affect the way that in the future applications are processed by the district. So while there's not really a right or wrong answer, we're kind of looking to council today to provide us a little bit of feedback based on their knowledge of the community, their vision for how things might be considered and how we might want to be moving forward with development in the future. There's nothing that's completely off the wall that council hasn't seen before. These are more kind of minor considerations, but they still do really affect the way developers interact with us as staff, as well as us as a community and mayor and council as well. So if there's no more questions for me at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Nancy. Nancy's very knowledgeable about all these things, and she'll go into more detail, but I believe Councillor Steer may have a question. Through the chair.
Through the chair. Yeah, Peter, thank you for that quick introduction. I just maybe just one little comment in terms of, as you pointed out, it's very specific in what they're asking for in here. The one area that maybe you might be able to answer is one of the areas is the delegation of authority between staff and council, which would be an area for much larger discussion, I think, in general. And I know this one's a little more specific to the development approval process. Through this particular process, what I'm wondering is, will this be able to lead to maybe a larger conversation around that delegation of authority in certain circumstances in this particular one, but I'm thinking in a much larger context. I'm channeling former councillor on this one, but I think you probably know where I'm going with it.
I think I understand. Thank you. Through the chair. I believe part of that question will probably be answered through Nancy's presentation and the kind of the conversations that we'll have today. But I guess in short, we're trying to draft a bylaw based on what we think works for the community. Bylaws can always be changed, so these things can lead to a different discussion at a later point in time if something that happens today doesn't turn out to be the right fit, maybe in 6 months. As far as larger delegations, what can be delegated to staff and what can't be delegated to staff is actually quite constrained by provincial legislation. So today we're just kind of talking about delegation to staff in terms of things like development permits or what we might consider minor development permits, which is some of the things that Councillor Barrett, as you alluded to, was concerned with during her tenure on council. But as far as larger, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by larger sorts of delegations, but that would kind of be constrained more by provincial legislation than outside of the conversation.
All right, thank you.
So I think I'll pass over to Nancy. I believe our corporate services will be promoting her to a presenter. She's going to be joining us via Zoom and will be walking us through the rest of the meeting.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of council. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen. Can you see that okay? Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, we're definitely going to be talking about delegation as it pertains to development permit applications and some of the other issues that you can delegate to help streamline those processes towards the end of the presentation today. So we can definitely dive into that in a little more detail. Just to start, I know we've had some new members of council from the last time that I was before you in August. So I was going to spend a few minutes just providing a bit of an overview on the previous review that we completed and presented to council and the context associated with that. Peter did cover quite a bit of it quite nicely in his introduction, so I'll move through this quite quickly. And then we get into really the workshop where I'll kind of explain some of the changes that have been going on in legislation, as well as the recommendations from our review. And then we'll be having sort of breaks where I'll be looking for you to provide some direction. And your direction is just, as Peter noted, it's going to influence how we draft the bylaw that we'll bring back to council for further consideration. But with your direction, we hope that process can be quite streamlined if we receive clear direction today. So I'll go through exactly what this development approvals procedures bylaw is all about. And we'll be looking at sort of that provincial context, as well as some recent changes to legislation, which is spurring on some of this conversation. And we'll get into how things are changing around public hearings, and maybe some other ways to engage the community as well that we'll be looking for specific direction from council on. And then we'll get into the delegation component and opportunities to consider delegation as a means of streamlining the development process. And then I'll just conclude with where we go from here. In terms of this provincial context, I'm sure council is all aware of, the housing crisis that we're in and the provincial discussion in and around this. There's been a lot of focus on municipalities and the time it takes to process applications, with the thinking that if we could speed up the application process, we'll increase the housing supply, and hopefully that will help with the affordability issues that we're facing. You've also, I'm sure, heard that, the province is looking at changing some legislation.
My apologies for interrupting. Nancy, we may need you to share your screen again because we've had a technical error on this side, so your presentation is not showing. Thank you.
We'll try that again.
Okay, it's back. Thank you.
Good, perfect. All right, so yeah, so you're seeing, in the media, there's constant changing and refining, to try to release and increase the housing supply. So that's really the context for why the municipality received this grant. So we're going to be talking about, how ideas that we have in potentially speeding up the process, but we have to make sure that we're fitting it within the context of Tofino and, where council's comfort level is as well. So when the province, did a provincial review in 2019 where they were kind of looking at trends across the whole province, which this exercise was kind of nice because, those in like Peter's position in local government often, have a lot of pressure from the development community to move things faster. And they always hear that things are better in the communities next door. But I think what the province found that there's a lot of consistency in the process. And things that are slowing down processes are things like applications that are not complete. Dealing with different levels of sophistication in the development community can be quite challenging. And some members of the development community kind of feel like staff should be doing, some items that are typically within the developer's role. The other thing, until very recently, like along with this review, applications like over the last 30 and 40 years have just been getting increasingly complex, and the legislation has typically changed over that period to allow for municipalities to ask for more, and also you've heard lots of opportunities where municipalities are also looking to negotiate things like community amenities through the process, which can also slow the process down and potentially increase costs to developers. So this complexity has added time to the process. The other thing the province identified was that there's a lot of inconsistency across the province. So I think that they're hoping that this $13 million of funding that was provided to various municipalities will also help them maybe create some more similar consistent processes across the province. And the development community certainly has identified that lack of consistency, and that more universal standards would be helpful for them. But that's not always the purview of municipal government. And also hope that there's more transparency so that the development community had a better idea of where their applications are at in the process. That's something that's also quite commonly heard. And then after doing the review, the province sort of came out with some changes in legislation that they felt would help municipalities speed up the process. And one of those was removing the default requirement to hold public hearings, but only for zoning bylaws that are consistent with the community's official community plan. So the thinking is that the municipality did a lot of engagement through the community plan process. And if this in a particular development conforms with the OCP, municipalities do not need to have a public hearing. However, and I'll go through this in detail throughout the presentation, council can always opt in to a public hearing if they wish. So we'll talk about the details around that. And they've also changed the legislation regarding delegation of development variance permits. So they're only minor development variance permits. So this would be another opportunity for potentially streamlining, and this will also fulfill like a fairly significant part of the presentation as well, and we'll be looking for direction from council. And in terms of the actual review that we're working on, as Peter mentioned, the municipality received $260,000 of funding, and this funding is very restricted to streamlining the development application process and amending the bylaws for the purpose of sort of reducing complexity, eliminating commonly requested variances, and just generally clarifying and streamlining the process. When we did the review, which was presented to council back in August, the development application procedures bylaw was identified as one area where there could be some amendments to help with application streamlining, as well as incorporating these changes to provincial legislation that I just identified, along with several other recommendations that will be done through other processes. But looking at delegation and also how the municipality does engage regarding the community and notifies the community regarding the development process will be sort of key to our discussion today. And all of this work that we're talking about today is fundable by the grant, which was 100% funding from UBCM. In our approach to this project is done in over 5 phases, some of which we're working on simultaneously right now, but we've completed phase 1 and 2. And then this is where in phase 4, we're updating, this bylaw, or probably several bylaws, and also looking at the process and ways to streamline it by sort of clarifying the steps associated with that. And Urban Systems is also responsible for carrying out the grant reporting to UBCM as well. So as you can see, we're kind of in this middle phase right now. This whole project has to be wrapped up by August 15th this summer, 2023. So just diving into the workshop here, and what is a development procedures bylaw or development approvals procedures bylaw? So essentially they generally incorporate several different sections of the Local Government Act or different legislation. And they essentially need to outline the processing procedures for different types of applications. You could have a separate bylaw, which is a development approval information bylaw. So that's the type of information that applicants need to provide with their application. Tofino currently has this in a separate bylaw. For ease of use, we're recommending combining the development approval information bylaw with the development application procedures bylaw, just so all the information is in one place. In these bylaws, it talks about notifications, so how you sending mail outs regarding applications, the distances in which you're sending out those mail outs, whether or not you have public information meetings, and they also can cover delegated authority. Currently, the district has a separate bylaw with delegated authority. I think so far the discussion's been keeping all delegated authority in one bylaw. However, some municipalities choose to put delegated authority regarding development applications in this bylaw as well. But that's a choice of yours and the municipality. And then also liquor licensing and cannabis processes can also be incorporated in the bylaw. I have the legislation in the presentation, and I know the district staff has this presentation. If you ever want to refer back to it, it's there for you, but I'm not going to go into the legislation. But if you want to know where some of these, the authority comes from, it's there for you. The scope of the bylaw is generally very technical. I would say, this is a bylaw that staff refers to quite regularly. Sometimes the development community may to have a better understanding of the process, but it's very sort of administrative focused. So we've got, a fairly large scope in the bylaw. The fees some municipalities choose to put it in the same bylaw, but there are advantages to putting fees in a separate bylaw in case you just want to do an inflationary update, for example, across all the fees in the municipality. It's a much easier process to do it that way. So we recommend that fees stay separate. So just moving towards the removal of default requirement for public hearings. And, I think municipalities were generally a little bit shocked with this change. And now that, many municipalities have started implementing the new legislation, I think it's working out okay, because it was, oh, well, how else could we engage the public other than having a public hearing? And I think by looking at that sort of holistic approach to engaging the community within the context of Tofino is something to kind of keep in the back of our mind. So how can we engage maybe differently and quite, with more thought put into it, potentially more effectively? Because council, you know what a public hearing is like. You've got to go in there with an open mind and listen. It's not really two-way dialogue. There's not a lot of idea exchanges, and it's also really late in the process. So the bylaws are already formed. The developer has often, or the applicant has often spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it sort of feels like the train is well out of the station. So in the presentation today, we'll talk about maybe some other options of maybe replacing that public hearing step earlier in the process, which it is extra steps, but potentially more effective than the public hearing. So, we'll talk about that and see what your comfort level is, and definitely be asking you for direction and how we write this into the bylaw. So we're going to talk a little bit about public open houses. That's typically referred to as public open houses in Tofino. We're suggesting, just for sort of that consistency across the provinces, we refer to them as public information meetings, and that public open houses would be more district-led projects. Like, for example, if you're doing your OCP or a water master plan and you wanted to have an open house, you'd refer to that as a public open house. And if it's regarding a development application, we'd call it a public information meeting. That's just a suggestion. And that notifications, mail outs, and signs to identify select development applications in progress are things that we're going to be talking about to kind of look at community engagement on specific types of applications more holistically. So focusing in on public hearings, and you would have seen this graphic in the review report. It's actually missing an important step for Tofino, is where you often have an additional step for permission to proceed or authorization to draft bylaws. First, there's a few municipalities around the province who do this step, and the vast majority don't. But we understand that, this works really well in Tofino. Council, as being a small town, likes to kind of know what's going on early in the process. And it also gives staff an opportunity to kind of check in and make sure that they should be spending time on a particular application, because council may have no interest in pursuing it, which is also a way of streamlining, because if you're churning applications around early in the process, it could save a lot of time. So it definitely seems to be a preferred approach. However, there might be times where you have a really simple application, or it's a very clear community priority, that you may wish to skip this step. And that can certainly be written into the bylaw and the procedures that, council could be put, or communication regarding an application could be done in a different way. But with that being said, the big change in legislation would be, if an application is in alignment with the OCP, is that notice would be given before first reading to surrounding neighboring properties. And basically, they could be providing comments to the municipality about how they feel about a particular development before the bylaw is presented to council. And then at that time, if there's a lot of community concern and council's not comfortable not having a public hearing, you can always opt in at that time. So even though, you might have quite a benign application and it would just move forward, you could potentially be giving, first, second, and third reading that night, potentially identify some conditions for them to satisfy prior to approval. And then once they do that, move forward to approval. So it could be, moving quite quickly through the process. And when you don't have conformity with the OCP, the procedure is exactly as you've been doing it as it is now. A public hearing would be required. So kind of looking at this change, how else can you engage the public? So one thing that Tofino has going for it is the timing in which you've just updated your official community plan, which included quite a great deal of community engagement. So council may feel more comfortable than some municipalities that have a 15-year-old official community plan that doesn't really represent their vision. This might be a little bit more of a scary predicament for them, but they can always opt in to public hearings. But yes, you have a up-to-date OCP. Public information meetings are encouraged as a substitute to provide for earlier engagement and improved dialogue in the process. And we'll spend some time outlining what that could look like and some of the best practices. And then also the notification mailouts are also an option. You could have notification as well for public information meetings, and considering signs to identify select development applications and process. And we'll talk a little bit about signs specifically and the existing bylaw requirements versus what we would recommend. So a few changes there. So the notice of application sign, so the existing bylaw places the onus on the applicant. However, practice is for staff to install. We recommend that, that onus be shifted completely on the applicant. Currently, the existing regulations link the requirement of a notification sign only when there's a public hearing. So we'd recommend that change. We'd also recommend that they go up earlier in the process. So before notification is sent out and before, if public information meetings are being required, before the public information meeting. Currently, there's no signs required for development permits, development variance permits, or temporary use permits. Definitely would recommend that may stay the same. Council may wish to include temporary use permit applications. Some municipalities do for signage, although staff has noted that just organizing signage into Tofino and getting it posted and printed is quite challenging. So that would just, for development permits, we do not recommend placing signage for those because they are non-discretionary, and it almost invites public into a process that there's no engagement opportunities. In terms of public notifications, amendments to the OCP zoning bylaw and permits that include variances currently require notification. But again, it's like tied to public hearings and a 60-meter radius. So there's a few amendments that need to take place there. And then temporary use permits, they don't have signage, but they do have notice requirements. So in terms of best practices, considering this in the context to the Bill 26 changes, which is the removal of the requirement for public hearings, is there's an opportunity for the municipality to consider engagement earlier in the process. So the notice of application signs would be one. There's definitely a trend. Tofino has a very colorful sign. We'll talk a little bit more about the signage moving forward. They're not recommended as noted for development permit applications. Potentially, council may wish to consider branding. You have some very great Tofino branding. The signage right now doesn't reflect that. So you may wish to brand the application signage to match the corporate branding, which will also be reflected in the brochures and other things that we're developing as well. And that the onus on construction and posting of the sign is on the applicant, but proofed by staff, and that they're put up prior to mailing out any notifications. This is your existing sign template. So you could see, you know, there'd be potential to even add like QR codes. Generally, you're starting to see more information like renderings or information about the project, and we'll want to change, you know, the reference to the public hearing. So there will be some amendments required. Here's just an example of one. It's just sort of more along the corporate branding lines, and also, you know, trying to potentially get, you know, social media and other ways of kind of getting in touch with the city, the municipality. So over to council now, just we'll be looking for some direction on signage. Does council support placing the onus on the applicant to develop and post the sign? And does council support sign placement earlier in the process and revising, you know, the current connection to public hearings? And would council like to expand the scope of applications requiring, or you can always add may require notice of application signs? So if it's may require, there could be some discretion on staff if, for example, it's a more complex application or controversial application. And looking for some direction or comments from council or any concerns.
Councillor Steer.
Well, through the chair, I like the raccoon on, never mind. I had some questions regarding the first part of there, and I wasn't prepared at this point to make any recommendations on the notice of applications in terms of what you've laid out here. It would take me a minute to go over what you've placed on here in terms of direction for that type of sign requirements. There's a great old song, signs everywhere, the signs clogging up the scenery. But I don't know, maybe I'll look to other council members and I'll give it a bit of thought. But I certainly can say that in terms of getting that information signage out earlier in the process, certainly very much support that aspect of what you have up on there right off the top of my head. And I might take a second or two to think further. Well, maybe just one comment on that I did write down around, there was some mentioning quickly around the TUP process, and in Tofino we do utilize that process fairly regularly. And the question, I think the question may have been, or that some municipalities do post that type of signage for TUPs, or did I misinterpret that one? I don't, and I'm looking to staff right now, I don't believe we do post that, or no, I got a confirmation of that. There may be some advantages to that in our community where TUPs are used quite regularly for a variety of information purposes.
Mr. Ray.
Sure. Thanks for this. I'm just going through our list here for the meeting. I just want to be clear. We're down to I've got number 3, public notification. Are we going back to discuss you know, removal of default requirements to hold public hearings and public information meetings? I'm just trying to follow along with our, before I answer the question on signs, I just kind of want to get a sense of where we're going in order here.
Yes, we'll be going back. Sorry if the report doesn't match the presentation, but just kind of going through some of the smaller items as we get into the heavier items.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to get a sense of where we're tracking. So, okay, fine. My opinion that signs would be great if they're earlier and had more information. And I think it's always a good way to get information out for temporary use permits. You know, people might want to know why there's something going on, and it might be hard for them to find out, and they may only just be walking by and noticing there's a trailer there. So I don't see a problem with expanding it, but that's my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
For temporary use permits, if that was something council was interested in.
Councillor Thomas.
Through the chair. We had spoken before about temporary use permits having signage for them for the same reason that Mayor Law just mentioned. So that people could be aware, because we have temporary use permits for things like trailers and stuff of that nature. And that way neighbors wouldn't be calling in going, oh, what's happening? And kind of wasting staff's time investigating things that are A-okay to happen. And I'm also in favor of earlier signage. I think more access to information is always appreciated by everyone. That's all I have to add at this moment.
Yeah, I'm in favor of earlier signage for public information meetings as well, just given that the use of social media is differing so much. We used to count on everyone being, really, paying attention to the same sites, and now people's interests are elsewhere and some people are disengaging from social media. So, I think a physical sign is probably going to reach the most people. And yeah, same thing with temporary use permits too. That way people know when these actions would apply for them. And Councillor Thomas?
For the first part, for the onus on the applicant, I think I would only be in favor of that if we gave them a very set template versus they fill in the blanks. That way there's no variances between what's getting posted. I don't know if it's necessarily any better to have them posted or staff posted if staff still have to go and check on it and make sure it's happening.
Councillor McMaster?
Yeah, I support putting the onus on the applicant to post the signs. I agree with Councillor Thomas that there should be a consistent template, but I think back to applying for a liquor license, they're very specific about the size of the signs and the size of the lettering and things like that, and I think it works well. I think people tend to notice things in this town more when they're walking by some sort of development. I support early posting or notice of these signs, and I also support the notice for the temporary use permits as well.
All right.
I support the earlier posting of signs, developing a signed template that was consistent would get people used to noticing that something is happening if it was branded and with the district whatever the district look. I forget that kind of branding, I think, would really make people notice more that it's something's happening that's district related. I think some signs get missed easily when there's a large block of land and there's nothing around it, and a large sign goes up. It does get noticed if it's on a street or a road or something. So I think there's some work to do around just the size of the sign, so that it does get noticed. I think the signs should be clear about whether it's going to a public hearing or a different process. So there should be some connection with what people can do to voice their opinion. Maybe the QR code is the way to go with that. I'm not really sure about requiring, I'm more with the may require than requiring on some applications. Yeah. I don't, our practice hasn't been to post, I guess, on temporary use permits. I'm not sure about development variances but I think there's times when a temporary use permit or some things are of a more impactful nature, and I think the requirement is more important in those times. So, and that should be either covering everything or at the discretion of council, I guess. I think one of the problems with using signage on fairly light applications is if it's sort of that trap of you know, you want people to pay attention to certain things, but if you get too many signs on everything, then they start to lose the attention where it's really needed. So, yeah.
Maybe on that note, having a specific type of sign for temporary use permits to differentiate from the types of, you know, the logo or design from a sign that would indicate a public information meeting. Councillor Anderson, is that what you're kind of getting at?
Well, I mean, the point is to engage the public as much as possible.
Mhm.
And also when it's most relevant to engage the public. So, and keeping that process as simple as possible is probably the best way to keep the public engaged. So yeah, I'd have to give that one some thought.
Okay. All right. Any other comments?
Well, I have my hand up.
Oh, sorry. Councillor Sloman.
So I, like everyone else there, support the earlier placement of the signs. And I agree with putting the onus on the applicant. I also support placing the signs earlier. I don't know if I said that maybe already, but I, like Councillor Anderson, am a little bit worried about the requiring or may require, because I feel like, yes, we could be covered in signs, and that I think maybe I need a little bit more clarity on that one, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. And just like one thing we can do when we bring the bylaw forward is we can look backwards a year or two and identify like the number of permits that have come forward to council and those which under the new bylaw would require signs. So you would have sort of an idea of how many signs we're talking about. But I think this is very good direction from council, and there's a lot of consistency that will help us draft this bylaw.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just one more thing. I didn't chime in on the onus on the applicant to develop and post the sign. I think, yes, a template that's consistent that the applicant has to produce to align with their proposal. And I think that they should also be required to post the sign. Just to keep staff time down to a minimum, really. That's the reason. We always have a busy planning department, and running up and putting up somebody's sign could take like a half a day away from city or more.
Yeah. So on that note too, something I know we'll hear about if we do move forward with requiring more signage is making sure that if there's a way we can look into maybe the materials that we're using are some way either reusable or can be recycled, because if we are seeing more signs popping up and they're all non-recyclable plastic and then they're ending up in the landfill, I'm sure there's a lot of people in town that will be very unhappy with that.
All right, thank you. Are there any other comments, or are we ready to move on to public information meetings?
I think we're all right.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. All right, so public information meetings, currently referred to or formerly known as perhaps public open houses. So we've talked about this already a little bit, but generally, local governments often have a common practice. It's not required by legislation of requiring developers to host public information meetings in advance of issuance of permits or even consideration of permits early on in the process. Sometimes you'll even see developers hosting public information meetings before they even apply. But in our process, we're sort of expecting public information meeting to be done in a way kind of outlined by this bylaw. It would allow for the early engagement of the community and sort of get community members together to kind of understand what's being proposed early on, so that the developer could respond to hopefully to their concerns. We would also recommend that in the bylaw that the applicant would be required to pull together like a what we heard report from the public information meetings. We'd also like to leave the district with a bit of a tip sheet for developers, so that they're looking at providing a balanced what we heard report, and there's some sort of guidelines on what the municipality would expect to see within that. Again, the use of may require in some situations. It might be required, I'd say, for all, like for example, official community plan amendments, but you may want to have a may require option there. So if it is just so aligned, or the municipality has been meeting on a particular affordable housing project several times already, that there'd be sort of an out clause. And that, if there's just really minimal impacts. Sometimes you might have a use in a bylaw that just wasn't contemplated, and it's just really a minor amendment. And in those cases, it seems like it might be a bit of a burden. But so we just provide that out. And again, as mentioned previously, just recommending changing the name to public information meetings when they're developer led. Bill Buhauser from Young Anderson, he's a very well-known lawyer who's essentially written the book on planning law. Before the changes to legislation, certainly was recommending that these types of meetings be held in the planning process, as many municipalities were not doing this. So just wanted to check in with council on how you feel about public information meetings. Do you want to encourage or require them? And just really want to hear from you. And early on in the process would be recommended prior to, for example, in a zoning application that was in conformance with the OCP, these you'd want to take place, well before notification and consideration by council. So over to you.
All right. Councillor Steer, I think.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you. I have a couple comments, but I did want to quickly check with staff. Peter, there was what I would term a public information meeting on a development proposal, the one back to Cypher Crescent. I think it's actually on Gibson Street, and it was engaged here. And that would have that been considered a public information meeting, or what was the structure of that? If you could remind me, because it was very effective, I think, in engaging and maybe alleviating some of the concerns and providing them more factual information. So if that's the context of it, that's something I would certainly support. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for the question through the chair. That was what we would call a public information meeting. I think at the time we called it an open house,
right?
But this is more of just a nomenclature thing. It's probably better to just call them public information meetings, to standardize things. But yeah, those types of meetings, just as a little bit of additional information, are very useful. Or as a staff person, I found it very useful. However, I would note that it does take more staff time than going through the standard public hearing process, which is a bit more of a kind of very organized, structured process. So there's a slight trade-off there, but in my opinion, as far as engagement goes, it is a bit more of an effective tool.
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you for that, because I thought so too. But I did want to check in with you. It did require, there was a lot of work that was involved on staff's time for that, but I think a much more effective engagement process than the standard public hearing. So I'd be very supportive of the public information meeting as may require for those types of applications that are more complex or have more community impacts potentially. So very supportive of that. And I think the may requirement, I'm still trying to understand how we would define may require and the ability for staff to make that decision, or if that should come to a council to say may require in those. But certainly I understand the sentiment behind it and would support a may require, just to alleviate not having to have that information process take up so much of time when it was very quote minor in change or whatever it might be. Leave it there.
And your worship.
Yeah, thanks for this. I just reading through, item 2 here on the report, public information meeting, and I agree that early engagement of the community is a great idea. However, I would not support requiring a potential developer to hold a public information meeting before the application came to council in any way. I think, in my opinion, we are the elected officials, we're the representatives. We should be, in some sense, the first public figures and public representation that sees an application. And I think right now we have permission to proceed, which I think does that. It allows us to look at the application and decide, some simple things about whether or not perhaps a public information meeting should be held, or a public hearing. I prefer that. I would not support having any developer go to the community first. I think that, in my mind, could confuse council's position if council were to decide not to go further or to proceed. That's my opinion for that one. But I do like the idea of a public information meeting, as long as it didn't overburden staff. So perhaps sometimes, but not others.
Okay, and Councillor Stewart.
If I could just follow up, and just to Mayor Law's comment there, I agree with Mayor Law on that, and I thought the permission to proceed was where that first engagement would take place, and then as if I remember correctly, on the public information meeting we had here, we already had the permission to proceed, and then this was the follow-up to that information session. So I would certainly support Mayor Law in that it comes to council first, and through that process, and then engage the public through the applicant with staff assistance on there. So just so that there's clarification on that.
Okay, Councillor Thomas.
Through the chair, I just wanted to agree with Mayor Law and Councillor Steer on the permission to proceed thing, and council kind of being the first ones to see those, just because I think deciding if something aligns with the OCP or not can sometimes be a little bit of a gray area. Like, even in my short time here, I feel like we've seen applications that are like mostly aligned, but there might be a couple of things, and I don't think we should be leaving that in other people's hands to kind of decide if it's enough aligned or not enough aligned. I think we'd be in hot water if we just kind of said, oh, we didn't see it, and we trusted somebody else to make that call.
And Councillor Anderson?
I guess I have a question on this. I don't think there's anything that really stops an applicant from having their own public information meeting at any time in the process. It's just to what extent it forms part of the district's process if they go ahead and have one. So what Mayor Law has proposed, that they not have a public information until council has seen an application. It prevents somebody from just going out and basically asking a question. Would this be supported, or do you think, and maybe fine tuning an application. But to what extent it forms part of the district's consideration at the council table, perhaps that's, it may or may not, if they've done it before their application. So yeah, I'm just wondering if an applicant is free to do a public information session that's not necessarily part of our process or in line with the order of our process.
And Nancy, followed by Mayor Law, followed by Peter. No.
Gonna answer the question.
Oh, sorry.
Nancy may wish to answer.
Oh, okay.
Okay, through the chair, just in response to the question and maybe just a few points of clarification as well. I think if a member of the public wants to have some form of public gathering to talk about something, I mean, that's something that you can't really stand in the way of. However, the public information meeting that would be required through this bylaw does have some, you're really trying to put the onus on the applicant to host this. But there would be some requirements that we would outline in the bylaw. So for example, like the type of facility the meeting would be held in to make sure that it was in the community and it would be accessible. It could potentially be virtual just based on our experiences in the last few years. But I think one of the key things with this public information meeting compared to say a developer-led another type of developer meeting is that we would recommend that one component that the district would play a part in this is that the district would essentially mail the notification of this public information meeting on behalf of the applicant, because you hold like the mailing list and you wouldn't want to share that public information with the developer to take that on. So most municipalities are sending out the notification. That notification would be recommended to go on a district, letterhead or template, so they know it's coming from the district and that it's official business. So I hope that might clarify some of the concerns. The other thing with this is just from a streamlining perspective, most municipalities would have no commitment to send staff or council to these meetings. However, many councillors, choose to swing by, and at times staff do attend, but it wouldn't be something that you would be required to do if resources didn't permit. So I hope that helps clarify.
I think so, yes, and I believe Mayor Law, followed by councillors too.
Just a quick comment for Councillor Anderson through the chair. I was just referring when I was making comments about the public information meeting. It was really related to requirements from the district to any developers, not private. Okay. It's just.
Councillor Stu.
Thank you through the chair. Just maybe some question around the requirement for the developer to provide the feedback from that public information session, that there would be written in there that is a requirement that they will have to provide that the feedback from the community on those public information meetings.
Yes, absolutely. That would be outlined in the bylaw, and we'd also have a guideline for them to follow to make sure that they're going into this with an open mind and that they're listening to both sides of the story. I think developers that don't do that and then present to council like there is no public concerns are probably not serving themselves well regardless. But that would be an important component, is that what we heard or summary report.
Thank you.
All right, and Councillor Thomas.
Through the chair, would it not be reasonable to require at least one representative of the district, whether it was staff or council, to be there just to make sure that the information we're getting is correct and not kind of manipulated in any way? And I just worry about sending out things with the district letterhead and then not having any representation from the actual municipality there. It might be very conflicting for people.
Interesting. Maybe I'll follow that question with the question. If I understand the way this would work, is that the developer would send the information that they will be mailing out to the public, to the district, which we would then send out with our letterhead. We would not be providing them with our letterhead to mail out their information because we have the information. So we would have some view of it. Is that right, Nancy?
Yeah, through the chair. I mean, this would be something we can work out definitely based on your feedback in the bylaw. Generally you want to make sure you could literally say, here's the mail out information and hand it, to the developer. But I mean, some municipalities do that. But I think if you had a template which was set up, that would just basically explaining, and you may wish to explain like that this is a developer-led event regarding an application they have with the municipality. So we could be very careful on the wording of that notification to make sure that it's clear. And then in terms of the representation, like you may wish to make that a practice, but in the bylaw, just in case things change or resources or someone got sick and didn't show up, it wouldn't be necessarily a requirement. But you would put it in the bylaw that, you know, staff or council may attend, that type of thing. So I think you just want to kind of word it in a way that foresees a couple different circumstances. And if the district had the opportunity and the resources to send staff and council is committed to going, I mean, I think it's an open event and you're should be more than welcome to attend.
Okay. Any questions, Councillor Sloman, McMaster? Okay.
Okay, so any other comments, or are we good to move on to delegation?
I think we're looking, oh, sorry, Councillor Anderson.
I'm just trying to get to what will come back in terms of when we might require it, when a public information session, or encourage it, or when we might go to the traditional more public hearing. Will there be sort of different levels of complexity or different levels of alignment with the OCP? I'm just wondering where the trigger points will be on those different types of decision. Will that be a decision of staff, or will it be a decision of council? So there's a few things in there need to be worked out too.
Yeah, through the chair, just as a bit of a response to that question, I mean, we'll outline the bylaw for council's consideration. Typically, you know, the public information meeting is a requirement in certain types of applications. We could lay out times when they're not. And I think there's a bit of a gut feeling in staff. Like, for example, I can think of a zoning amendment that I worked on, and a distillery and a brewery was permitted, but a meadery was not. In that case, you're adding meadery to the permitted uses in the zone. It's so minor, you know, those would be situations where you just would want to have that may require clause, right? But if it's a major application, you know, I think staff would typically have a good feel as to when those types of events would be required. I think generally the public information meeting for zoning and OCP applications would always be required. But then unless it was such a minor change, like I was just discussing, but then the public hearing would be where council would opt in at first reading if it wasn't a default requirement, so that you would have that opportunity going like, you know what, we need more discussion on this. So that would be at first reading, you could opt in. But with your permission to proceed approach, I think council also has the ability, like staff could kind of like lay out a bit of an outline in the procedure, and that would be an opportunity where council could say, you know what, staff, I think this is going to be a big one for the community. I really think we should be doing, you know, A, B, and C. I think Tofino has that luxury.
Nice.
Okay, so are we good to go to delegation?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right, so delegation to staff. So this discussion is rooted in the provincial development approvals process review. It came up as a high priority item to basically increase the ability to delegate and also to sort of utilize those powers, because they did find out that there is usually sort of a 6-week to 2 or so month improvement in process timelines as a result of delegation. So the province is certainly encouraging more delegation, and then you can see this with the changes in the minor variances. But it's important to establish like that comfort level with the local government, and looking also, at the state of the official community plan and how this council feels, for example, about your development permit guidelines. So we want to make sure that we're reflecting in our recommendations the current sort of feelings of council in and around delegation. So they must be, anything you're delegating, it must be established by a bylaw. Like, you can actually delegate public hearings, and that would be done by a resolution. Most municipalities don't do that, but some do. Examples of decision-making powers that can be delegated. So approval of all development permits could be delegated, heritage alteration permits if you had those, now newly minor development variance permits. Basically delegated decisions, anything that is delegated from an application standpoint, those decisions can be reconsidered by council at that applicant's request, so they're entitled to that. Issuance of conditional permits such as temporary use permits, development variance permits, or council approved DPs that have conditions that council lays out, those can also be delegated to staff to issue. And that's pretty much standard across the board, 100%, as well as the requirement of development approval information. That's just another example. So development permits are not discretionary. And I think that's something that a lot of councils have a hard time with, especially if you're new or don't see a lot of development permits, is that there are development permit guidelines, and council is bound to those guidelines, as is the applicant. So the applicants that come forward have to meet them. So there's no discretion. And some municipalities have got themselves into trouble and had some court cases against them where they've maybe done, taken some of the considerations or concerns from surrounding property owners into account when they're considering the approval of a development permit. And some of those decisions have been overturned by the court. It's very clear that if, for example, one building in this case that I've kind of quoted here in White Rock, if I remember correctly, the surrounding neighborhood had a concern with the height, but the height of the development met the zoning, and it also met, the development permit guidelines. So the courts actually overturned council's decision. So, something to think about. It sounds maybe scary to some council to, pass this on to staff. But because they're non-discretionary and you're bound by the guidelines, many municipalities are starting to transfer greater DP delegation powers onto staff. And I think if council's not liking what they're seeing, the key here is change the development permit guidelines, and the approval of those guidelines rests with council. So just things to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. The existing scope of delegated development permits, your current practice, is essentially what many municipalities would refer to as technical development permits. So your sort of environmental, wildlife type development permits, steep slope, for example. These are also supported by professional reports. So staff are relying on the recommendations of those professional reports when also making a decision. So it's very common that those technical DPs are delegated to staff. Quite rarely now, council is approving those. There's the odd case, but generally they're delegated. Some communities delegate all development permits to staff, such as Comox, Fernie, New Westminster, Vernon, delegate all. Some communities are also delegating multifamily developments, as an example, with certain criteria. So in other smaller municipalities of Summerland, they've just made a recent change where they're delegating all multifamily development permits up to 3 stories in a certain square footage or square meters, as well as mixed use developments up to 3 stories. So you can see those criterias. Others will also say when they're really promoting infill development in their community, and that and in some communities, you're sort of seeing more of those applications than a 3-story mixed-use building, which you might see once a year. But those infill type developments are also getting delegated to staff. And like sometimes municipalities will say, well, you know, up to 4 units will delegate to staff. But so really for the purpose of this bylaw, we do need to have some direction from council on how you feel about increasing the scope of delegated development permits. And, you know, and also if you did want to increase that scope, you know, if you could be really clear on what types of development permits you want to see at the council table. So in downtown, for example, you know, some municipalities will say, we'll delegate everything except our downtown core. We want to see all those applications. But anyway, just some food for thought and just looking for direction from council on if there's any interest in expanding the scope at all, and if so, what?
All right, Mayor Watt.
Thanks, Nancy. Could you go back to the list of development permits? Just want to go through these. This is in Tofino right now. We have a pretty new council. Most councils are new these days. So I just want to make sure, like, this is a fairly large question for a new council, and I want to maybe ask through the chair, staff to maybe give a little explanation of what development permits are currently brought to council, and maybe give a little concrete, maybe an imaginary example of how that looks, so that council can understand what it is we're being asked.
Certainly, thank you for the question, Mayor Law, and through the chair. As Nancy noted, that it's very common that technical development permits, so these are things like, for us, we have the foreshore or the riparian or the mud flats or the steep slopes development permit areas. These are the types of development areas that we look to registered professionals to provide us advice on. So often these are environmental in nature or geotechnical in nature. And they require a specialized area of knowledge for people to provide us with recommendations as to how a development should go forward. So in those cases, they're often delegated to staff, as it doesn't always make a lot of sense to bring them to council, given that we already have dedicated professionals understanding and opinion, I guess, guiding the decisions and guiding the development permit process at that point. So because it's a very kind of specialized area of knowledge, usually we'll just look to the professionals to guide us on that, and then we'll incorporate all professional recommendations into the permit itself. And those are the recommendations that the applicant has to follow with whatever their development might be. The ones that are potentially a little bit more open for a little bit of interpretation are the ones that we generally lump into the idea of form and character development permits. So these are typically our downtown development permits. So for example, we have a Main Street development permit area, a Campbell Street development permit area, and a Gateway development permit area. These are basically cover the whole downtown area heading out towards Olson Road. So for any development outside of a single family house or a duplex, they're required to have a development permit that outlines not necessarily what the impact of the environment is going to be, or the potential for geotechnical hazards, but more outlines considerations for what the building's actually going to look like. So within our development permit area guidelines, we have specific guidelines that the design is required to follow. They're fairly general guidelines. You know, it's not very specific, but they have some very kind of particular overall, guides for what a building should generally look like. The idea is to avoid, say a pink box or something like that. That's something that would be completely incongruous with the general character of Tofino as we know it, or the vision that we've established in the official community plan. One of the things that's important to remember about development permits are, as Nancy noted, they're non-discretionary. So if a development permit meets the requirements that we've outlined in our development permit guidelines, as a council, as staff, we have an obligation to issue that development permit. The idea is, if we don't like the design, it's not the fault of the developer, it's the fault of our guidelines, and we need to improve our guidelines. So often this is used as a rationale to delegate all development permits to staff, because there's actually less discretionary authority that council has than as opposed to a development variance permit or a zoning amendment bylaw or something like that. However, the form and character guidelines can be interpreted in certain ways, and maybe are available for a little bit more flexibility than the purely technical DPs. So that's why currently they're brought to council, and council, they can only be issued by council. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there, and if there's any questions or any follow-up comments, I'm happy to speak to those as well, but that's sort of the overall gist.
I have one follow-up question.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up question, because we're talking about forming character, can you just briefly describe the role of the design review panel in that process?
Yeah, certainly. So thank you, Mayor Law. Through the chair, we do have a design review panel that's associated with the district. They're a group of local volunteers. There's 5 people on the panel, and they review all applications that apply to these types of development permit areas before they come to council, and they often provide recommendations to council. So the overall process currently is usually somebody's got their zoning in place and they're ready to build something. So they apply for development permits prior to applying for a building permit, but the development permit is just kind of, they're saying, here's what I'm going to build, more or less. Staff will receive the application, and usually our first step is to schedule a design review panel meeting, which is we just gather everybody who's on the panel and we pick a date that works, and we all sit down, often in this room or over Zoom, as it has been the last few years, and review the design with respect to the development permit area guidelines. And so often the design review panel will make comments about the design, how it meets or does not meet the design review, the development permit guidelines in their opinion. If it's something that they feel is acceptable, meets the guidelines, meets the intention of the guidelines, they'll often say, okay, well, we have no further comments on this, and they'll pass a resolution that says we encourage council to issue this development permit for the design that's being proposed. At that point, once the design review panel has had a review and they're satisfied with their review, that's when staff will bring it to council for issuance, and council review essentially at that point. So prior to anything coming to council, we do have the design review panel review things as well. I would note that this was a very important step up until, I believe it was about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, as up until that point, actually all development permits were previously delegated to staff. It was only a few years ago that that was changed, and I think it was in 2019 where the form and character, the downtown form and character development permits were actually brought back into council's purview. So the design review panel played a very critical role, particularly when council was not issuing these permits, as they were sort of the additional eyes on top of staff's eyes that would take a close look at the applications prior to them being issued.
I have one more follow-up question for information.
And then it's Councillor Steer's turn.
Just for information, just because so in the design review panel, when the design review panel was working and it was delegated to staff before, or sorry, since it's been delegated to, taken away from staff, I guess, has council not approved something that the design review panel has sort of recommended?
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, to my knowledge, no. Usually by the time it reaches council, there's fairly good rationale for the design and it meets the design guidelines. Again, at that point, once something meets the guidelines, council has to have a very strong and clear rationale for refusing it. Otherwise, you can get yourself into legal trouble quite quickly. In a way, I think of development permits as more akin to a building permit as opposed to a rezoning. They're less of a political process and more of a almost like a checklist kind of process. That's not to say there's not any room for interpretation, of course, but they are, again, non-discretionary is the term.
Okay, that's, and I thank you.
Okay, Councillor Steer.
Yeah, and just to quickly add to that one, just I think a lot of the issues around that are certainly around in the downtown core, where most of those form and design are where council really likes to have their input in, historically speaking. The question around the technical, in terms of the question around expanding the scope for staff and on those non-discretionary and technical aspects, and I see many of them are up in front of us there. I would support that with the one caveat that I know many of them are technical, and those bodies that we task out for those services, you know, they adhere to professional guidelines and within their own profession, such as planning, et cetera, et cetera. There has been occasion where I personally have, and this is a personal thing, where the information I wasn't comfortable with, and I thought as the profession grows and there's an expansion, there are discrepancies between individual companies that provide those services, and there's been times in the past where I thought those recommendations weren't as extensive enough. So it's my caution on still allowing that you know, that discretionary fact. So it's just a comment to bring out where, especially around environmental type issues in a town such as ours, that can be a cautionary aspect moving forward. And I think almost always, though, and Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, that staff is always informing council whenever we have one. They've always come forward to explain to us. There hasn't been that many, to be frank, but when those development permit areas are invoked, you always come to us and explain in detail about the process and give us the information that's needed. So with this present staff, I've been very comfortable with that process of being informed about that, even though many of those technical aspect ones, as you say, it makes sense to have staff doing that in that aspect, but we are well informed just for other councils, and I've always appreciated that. So I'll leave it at that. I would still, in terms of those, as has been pointed out in detail in terms of design and review those more discretionary type areas, I still think I still think the process that we've been is, as indicated back in, I think it was 2019, if that was right, that we still retain that aspect of it. I don't think it delays the process, and if the whole goal of this is to streamline and make it more important, I still think there is the ability for councils to make those kinds of important design. It is affecting those very important things, and in my estimation, it didn't slow the process down or make it cumbersome, in my opinion. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I have a question actually for Zetiana. Just so I can understand, in those types of development permit applications, would those go to open or closed council, given that they're dealing with private property?
Through the chair, I believe those go to an open meeting. Yeah, they wouldn't go to a closed meeting.
So then if we were going to delegate those to staff, my concern would be that by removing them from regular council meetings, it does limit the chance for the public to read those applications in the minutes and then to submit comments in the meetings. And my concern would be that, given that a lot of those issues are of great concern to the people that live here, they would feel that they're losing their chance to express a comment or ask a question later on in the meeting on that application.
So I can speak.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. In this particular situation, sort of two things come to mind. Typically, if there's minutes kept for every design review panel meeting, those minutes are usually included on a particular council agenda, usually the council after that the meeting's been held. So at that point, the minutes of the DRP, which includes all the applications, are made public. So there is sort of an opportunity there. If I'm not mistaken, though, I think what you're kind of getting at is that there may be not as much opportunity for the public to comment on these applications in general, should they be delegated to staff. I think the one comment I would make around that is again, these are non-discretionary. So if a particular member of the public has an issue with a particular design, it's sometimes important to separate their personal opinion of the design versus whether or not the design actually meets the development permit guidelines. And again, if something can be demonstrated clearly, and of course, again, there's always a little bit of wiggle room here, but if something can be demonstrated clearly to meet both the zoning and the development permit guidelines, the zoning, pardon me, and the development permit guidelines, a lot of times the public input, which represents more personal opinion as opposed to like actual opposition to something because it doesn't meet development permit guidelines, is not that helpful to the overall process.
May I offer a comment?
Yeah, for sure.
As someone with a long history, I think something to consider, and I'm not suggesting it one way or the other, is that currently what you have in place is a system where staff reviews, the DRP reviews, and the council reviews. I think that's why it slows down. And I think what you would want to do to speed it up is either remove, like staff has to review it, so you either remove the DRP and no longer need DRP, or you remove council, and you end up with a two review process. So structurally, it's how many eyes we're putting on it at what time. So something maybe for council to consider if you're looking to speed something up is removing one of those items. Big meal is just a comment.
Yeah, and just to follow up really quickly, back to Peter, is just not saying so much that the council meeting is an opportunity for people to debate or have a public hearing, but more just that it's a really clear opportunity for people to hear about these things. And like a lot of meetings, when someone speaks and then we put it to staff and staff say, we can email you that report, and then they've gotten their information that way. So, or, they see it in the minutes and they email the district and the district emails them the report that's going to be in the meeting. So my concern would be finding a way to still have that information visible and accessible to the public, I guess. That's the point of my question.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer or find an opportunity that would still allow the public to kind of get access to that information. Again, sorry.
Nancy has her hand up. She might have a good idea.
Yeah, maybe I'll pass it to Nancy in case she has some clarity that might be able to help.
Yeah, through the chair and just in terms of the question regarding transparency, I think is really what the council is looking for. And I mean, many municipalities will have a current application list, that's posted publicly on their website so that people can see what's going on. And then it would also be recommended that through sort of when the administration is reporting out to council, I'm not sure if you have quarterly or semi-annual reporting or annual reporting to council, but that you're actually providing, the list of current applications as well. And just there's other opportunities to make that information publicly available and transparent, that there is an application and they can always reach out to staff. Is the way that the municipalities that are delegating DPs generally have other forms of transparency for the public to kind of see what's going on, and then also opportunities for council to kind of have a really good understanding of what's being approved. And then you can always review your bylaws as well in the future, as you did in 2019.
Thanks. And I believe Councillor Anderson had a question, and then we might need to move things along fairly quickly here.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I'm satisfied with our current practice of delegation of these development permits. The only area that I can think of I'd like to see maybe an expansion of delegation is on moving housing, any type of multifamily dwelling, or, well, maybe not any type, maybe up to 8 units or something like that, to consider that if the zoning's in place, then it may need to go through the design review panel if it's in certain development areas, but otherwise I don't see why the staff couldn't issue a development permit and speed up certain types of housing that offer more affordable options. So I would be in favor of something coming forward to look at delegating that as well.
All right. And Alan?
Yeah, just having a look at the time, there is a little bit more to go through and we don't want to rush this conversation with council. So we may have to end this meeting because we have another one scheduled for 4:30 and then staff will come back and propose a second date to go over the rest of the material.
Okay. So then do I move to?
You could probably make a motion to staff to come back with another, to continue this at another date.
This is like
They're gonna
Robert's
confer it.
rules bingo.
You can refer it to staff for
Can I
for
adjourn the
suggestion.
meeting?
Nope, don't adjourn yet.
Don't.
You recess to future.
Your CAO.
All right.
Thank you. So the appropriate thing to do would be to resolve to refer this to a future committee of the whole meeting.
Okay. All
For
right.
the discussion, and you can refer, or the discussion, you can refer to it as the title on the agenda. For the discussion regarding Tofino Development Approvals Procedures Bylaw Update to a future committee of the whole meeting.
All right, then I move to refer the presentation on Tofino Development Approvals Procedures Bylaw Update to a later date and to a future date.
Committee of the whole.
Committee of the whole.
I second it.
Thank you.
Further
All in
comments?
favor? Further comments from council? We have a vote.
So I'm calling the question.
I'm calling question.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Perfect. None opposed. Motion carried.
None opposed, motion carried. And now I adjourn the meeting.
It's adjourned. Thank you. Good job. Yeah. Woo, that's a good job. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you. We'll see you again.